Can a single election literally break a nation? You know, it's a pretty terrifying question. But back in the winter of 1860, the United States found out the answer was a resounding yes. A constitutional crisis of just unimaginable proportions was about to tear the country apart, pitting state against state and brother against brother.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're taking a deep dive into the political earthquake that absolutely shattered the United States, the election that split America apart. We'll be relying entirely on primary sources, historical records, and the exact words of the people who lived it to understand how Abraham Lincoln's victory triggered the greatest political crisis in U.S. history.
Okay, let's dive right into Section 1, the 1860 tipping point. To really understand this explosion, we have to look at the spark. Just look at this number right here, 0. In the November 1860 presidential election, Abraham Lincoln, the candidate for the newly formed Republican Party, won the presidency with exactly 0 electoral votes from the South. I mean, his name wasn't even on the ballot in a lot of southern states. His victory sent a clear, undeniable signal to the slaveholding states of the Deep South. They had completely lost their influence over the national executive branch. They were, all of a sudden, totally isolated politically.
And the unraveling? It was terrifyingly rapid. Just look how fast this happens. In November 1860, Lincoln is elected. Just weeks later, on December 20th, South Carolina officially secedes from the Union. By February 1861, a brand new government, the Confederate States of America, is formed down in Montgomery, Alabama. And by April, Confederate forces fire on federal property at Fort Sumter. In merely 5 months, a political defeat transformed into open warfare. But of course, this didn't just happen overnight.
Let's look at how we got there in Section 2, Decades of Division.
Now, this explosion was actually decades in the making. The 1860 election was basically just the match that lit a massive, long-established powder keg. For 40 years, the nation had relied on failing political band-aids to mediate a bitter battle over the American West. Every single time the country expanded, a crisis erupted over whether the new territory would be free or slave. We see the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which tried to draw a geographic line. Then the Compromise of 1850, which included the deeply controversial Fugitive Slave Act forcing Northerners to return self-emancipated individuals. This was followed by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which led to literal bloodshed in what was called Bleeding Kansas. And finally, the 1857 Dred Scott decision, where the Supreme Court ruled that African Americans possessed no constitutional citizenship rights.
So what does this all mean? Ultimately, territorial expansion meant deciding the future of slavery. Every new piece of land forced the country to confront its greatest moral, political, and economic divide. The compromises had finally completely run out.
Which brings us to Section 3, the Apostles of Disunion.
Now, what's really interesting here is the immediate panicked reaction of the Deep South to Lincoln's election. In the winter of 1860 and 1861, a deeply influential, yet often totally overlooked group of 52 men known as secession commissioners emerged. According to the research of historian Charles B. Dew, these were men dispatched by states like Mississippi and Alabama. Their mission? To travel to other slave states and convince them to join the secession movement. They were essentially the evangelists of disunion, and their arguments were incredibly explicit.
The exact words they used? They were completely unfiltered. Take a look at this primary source quote from William L. Harris, a Mississippi commissioner, speaking to the state of Georgia in December 1860. He warned that Lincoln's election threatened a government that was built, in his exact words, for the white man rejecting the Negro as an ignorant, inferior, barbarian race incapable of self-government. He argued that secession was literally the only way to prevent the destruction of this social order.
And you know, this wasn't just some isolated viewpoint. Here we have Stephen Fowler Hale, an Alabama commissioner, writing to the governor of Kentucky. He warned that under Lincoln's Republican administration, white Southerners would be degraded to a position of equality with free Negroes, or else there will be an eternal war of the races, desolating the land with blood. They actively fan the flames of fear regarding racial equality and slave rebellion just to build a coalition for secession.
So, the crucial point here is that when we cut through decades of historical myths and look directly at the primary sources, the secession ordinances, and the actual speeches of the commissioners themselves, an undeniable reality emerges. Secession was fundamentally about preserving racial slavery and the supremacy of the white race. They stated it clearly, passionately, and publicly.
All right, let's shift gears to Section 4, 2 presidents, 1 crisis.
With the nation officially fractured, the crisis fell squarely onto the shoulders of the two men chosen to lead these divided factions. And here is one of history's most incredible ironies. Both the President of the United States and the President of the Confederacy were born in Kentucky log cabins, literally less than 100 miles apart from each other. But despite their geographic origins, they possessed immensely different approaches to leadership.
Take Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy. Davis had a very strong military background. He firmly believed that a nation at war required his absolute, unwavering direction. He was very much a man who felt he always knew best.
But their leadership styles, they literally couldn't have been more different. Lincoln was deeply pragmatic and adaptable. I mean, he famously appointed a team of rivals to his cabinet, guys who actively disagreed with him because he genuinely valued their administrative competence. He delegated command, constantly searching for generals who would just fight aggressively. Davis, on the other hand, was rigid and aristocratic. He had this huge tendency to micromanage his military commanders and expected unquestioning obedience, often treating differing opinions as personal dissent.
That leads us right into Section 5, Unprecedented War Powers. Regardless of their personalities, though, both of these men quickly realized that this existential crisis demanded seizing powers no American president had ever held. To survive the war, both presidents fundamentally altered the rules, leading to a massive, rapid expansion of the executive branch. They suspended the writ of habeas corpus, meaning people could be jailed without trial. They instituted mandatory military drafts, forcing citizens into the army. They authorized the military arrest of civilians and the confiscation of enemy property. Basically, civil liberties were suddenly traded for national security in an entirely unprecedented way. And this brilliantly illustrates how they wielded this newly expanded power very differently. Lincoln acted boldly, stretching the Constitution to its absolute limits to preserve the Union. When Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled that Lincoln didn't have the authority to suspend habeas corpus, Lincoln basically just ignored him. He argued that he couldn't let the entire nation fall apart just to save one single law. Davis, conversely, acted much more cautiously. Leading a rebellion founded on the idea of states' rights, he constantly struggled with his own Confederate Congress, relying on them to grant him these very short, temporary suspensions of habeas corpus.
But Lincoln's boldest executive stroke, the one that would completely redefine the entire purpose of this crisis, well, that occurred during the first reading of the Emancipation Proclamation before his cabinet.
See, Lincoln brilliantly tied emancipation directly to his military war powers. Issued on January 1, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was framed explicitly as a fit and necessary war measure. Acting as commander-in-chief, Lincoln used it to strike right at the economic root of the South's rebellion. By freeing enslaved people in rebelling territories and authorizing African Americans to join the Union military, he simultaneously weakened the Confederacy's labor force and strengthened the Union Army. This fundamentally changed the war from a fight to just preserve the Union into a full-blown crusade to end slavery.
So, what does this all mean for us today? The election of 1860 split the nation, and 4 years of brutal, completely unprecedented war forced it back together. But we really have to ask ourselves, did the resulting war truly resolve the deep, underlying crisis of racial inequality and regional division, or did it just change the battlefield for the generations that followed? It's a heavy question, and it's one we are for sure still grappling with today. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.